Listen up, sweetheart. In this town, my badge is the only law. Your voice means nothing. Your rights mean nothing. And tonight, you belong to us. You think your fancy clothes, your smart mouth, or whoever you think you are will protect you. Not here. Here in Copper Creek, we decide who walks out smiling and who crawls out broken. Those were the shocking words Sergeant Rick Callahan spat across the table, his eyes red with whiskey, his smirk full of arrogance, as the entire bar fell into stunned silence. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Danielle Johnson and her twin sister Dominique had come back to their hometown on what was supposed to be a quiet evening, stopping at Bayou Jack's Tavern for nothing more than a drink and a chance to unwind. But destiny had other plans. Rick Callahan, a 42-year-old police sergeant known for throwing his weight around, saw them not as women enjoying a night out, but as prey. Behind him came Officer Mark Hale, thick-set and towering, his presence heavy like a wall closing in, and Kyle Benson, the youngest officer, sloppy drunk yet desperate to prove himself cruel in front of his superiors. The three men approached the sisters like wolves circling their target. Rick pressed both palms onto the table, leaning down until Danielle could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You think you're in charge here?" he sneered, voice dripping with menace. Danielle did not flinch. She straightened her spine, locked her gaze on him, and said calmly, "Step back. We don't want trouble." That single sentence, spoken with strength, only made his grin wider. Mark moved behind Dominique, his hands gripping the back of her chair, pressing her down slightly, testing her resolve. Dominique, calm but sharp, warned in a low voice, "Take your hand off me." Mark chuckled like he had heard a joke. Squeezing harder, Kyle staggered forward, his laughter sloppy, his words disgusting. "Twins, huh? Double the chocolate, double the fun." Around them, the bar went silent. Customers stared into their glasses, refusing to make eye contact. A woman near the jukebox picked up her purse and hurried out. Nobody wanted to challenge officers in Copper Creek. Behind the counter, bartender Luis Ramirez froze, his rag motionless in his hand, his jaw tight, eyes burning with a quiet fury. He had seen this before. He knew what came next. Rick dragged a chair, straddled it backward, and leaned even closer to Danielle. "Let me explain something," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "This is my bar, my street, my town. Whatever happens here happens because I say so. You're nothing but a couple of mouths that need to learn respect." Danielle's dark eyes never wavered. "You are making a mistake," she said steadily. "Walk away while you still can." Rick barked out a laugh that made the hair on the back of people's necks rise. He looked over his shoulder at Mark and Kyle. "Hear that? She thinks she's giving orders." Kyle leaned so close to Dominique that she could feel his breath. "You wear those shorts. You sit here looking fine. And you think we're just gonna leave you alone? Sweetheart, you're begging for attention." Dominique's jaw tightened, but she stayed still, knowing one wrong move could ignite violence. Danielle reached for her purse, only to be met by Rick's eyes narrowing. "Got something in there for me?" he taunted. Danielle replied smoothly, "Just lipstick, though I doubt it's your shade." Mark's grip tightened on Dominique's shoulders until his knuckles whitened. "Your problem is no respect for authority. But don't worry, we'll fix that." The three officers roared with laughter, their noise filling the uneasy silence. A young man at a corner table discreetly raised his phone to record, but Kyle spotted him, stumbling toward him until Rick whistled sharply. "Later," Rick said. "First, these ladies need a lesson." He turned back to Danielle, his smirk now gone, replaced by the cold focus of a man who enjoyed breaking others. "Here's what's gonna happen. You're going to apologize for your attitude, buy us around, and if you're real sweet, maybe we'll forgive your little disrespect." Danielle lifted her glass, took a slow sip and set it down carefully, her voice steady as steel. "Here's what will happen. You will take your hands off my sister, step away from this table, and leave us alone. Because right now, you are making the biggest mistake of your career." Rick's face hardened, the smirk twisting into something predatory. He snapped his fingers. "Did you hear that? Boys? A threat? Threatening officers? Serious crime?" Kyle grinned eagerly, fumbling with his cuffs. "Yep, definitely a threat." Mark laughed low. "Looks like we get to take them in." And just like that, the trap was sprung. Mark yanked Dominique out of her chair. Kyle snapped cold steel around her wrists, too tight on purpose, while Rick shoved Danielle against the wall, pinning her by the shoulder, wrenching her arms back. The metallic click of cuffs echoed through the tavern. Dominique stumbled to her knees, the cuffs biting into her skin. Danielle gasped as splinters from the wall dug into her cheek. Rick raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, these two are under arrest for threatening officers. Anyone got a problem with that?" Silence. Heads down. Nobody moved. Luis swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he bent low under the counter, switching on the tiny camera he had hidden months earlier, capturing everything. He knew this wasn't the first time, but maybe it could be the last. Kyle jerked Dominique to her feet. Mark shoved Danielle toward the door, and Rick strutted behind them like a conquering king. The bar stayed frozen, patrons pretending not to see as the sisters were dragged out into the humid Louisiana night. The patrol car sat waiting, headlights on, engine rumbling. Rick shoved Danielle inside. Mark pushed Dominique so hard she nearly fell face first onto the seat. Kyle slammed the door with a cruel laugh. Rick leaned into the window, eyes glittering. "Welcome to Copper Creek, sweetheart. Tonight. You learn the hard way. Nobody crosses us and walks away." The engine roared. The car pulled off into the dark, and Danielle glanced once through the glass at Luis, still standing frozen at the bar door. Their eyes met for a split second, enough to promise that justice would come, even if it cost everything. The patrol car screeched to a halt outside the Copper Creek Police Department, its cracked neon sign buzzing faintly above the heavy steel doors. And before Danielle and Dominique could even adjust to the harsh fluorescent light spilling from the lobby, they were yanked out by Mark Hale and shoved forward like criminals on display, their wrists raw from the cuffs, their dignity hanging by a thread. And as they stumbled inside, the room fell quiet. A silence that cut sharper than any words, because every officer present knew what was happening, yet not one lifted a finger to stop it. Rick Callahan strutted in behind them, puffed up with drunken pride, his voice booming. "Two disorderly suspects, charged with threatening officers and resisting arrest." His words dripping with mockery as he waved the paperwork toward the clerk at the desk, who hesitated only a moment before stamping the forms, his eyes darting nervously to the sisters as though he knew this was wrong but had no courage to intervene. Dominique's chest rose and fell with controlled fury, her military training keeping her grounded, but inside she burned with rage, every nerve screaming to fight back, while Danielle, ever the strategist, kept her eyes scanning the room, memorizing faces, exits, and the subtle nods between the officers, already mapping the network of corruption that pulsed through this station. They were shoved into a holding cell with peeling paint and the stench of mildew, the heavy door slamming shut with a clang that echoed down the corridor, and Rick leaned against the bars, grinning. "See how fast respect comes when you're behind bars? Welcome home, ladies." But just as his laughter rang out, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps filled the hallway. And then Chief Raymond Holt appeared, a tall man in his mid-50s with a polished badge, pressed uniform, and eyes as cold as stone, the kind of eyes that didn't need to shout to command obedience. The officers straightened instantly, even Rick sobering slightly as Holt approached, his voice calm but cutting like a blade. "What exactly have we here?" Rick puffed his chest again, eager to impress. "Two loudmouths threatening my men, resisting arrest, making a scene at Bayou Jack's. We brought them in for processing." Holt turned his head, studying Danielle and Dominique through the bars, his gaze sharp, and after a long pause he said quietly, "Something tells me these two are not just loudmouths." Danielle stepped forward, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "You're right. We are not. We are federal agents with the Bureau, conducting work that does not concern you. What you've done tonight is unlawful arrest, harassment, and abuse of power. Release us now, or your career ends tonight." The room seemed to freeze, a hush falling as though time itself had stopped. But then Holt smiled faintly, not in surprise, but in amusement, and he replied softly, "Federal agents, is that what you are? You think that matters here? You think your bureau protects you in Copper Creek? I decide what happens in this town. And believe me, not even Washington can save you once you're in my house." Dominique's fists clenched at her sides, her voice low but fierce. "You just confessed to corruption in front of your own men. You're finished." Holt stepped closer to the bars, his face inches from hers, his tone still calm but now filled with venom. "You don't understand. We don't fear exposure because nobody outside these walls will ever hear you. My men write the reports. My judges sign the warrants. My friends in high places bury the noise. You're not the first outsiders to wander in here, and you won't be the last to disappear." The words landed like blows, and though Danielle's expression remained controlled, her heart hammered, because she knew he wasn't bluffing. Behind them, Kyle Benson slurred, "Should have stayed home. Ladies, you ain't leaving tonight." Mark laughed, the sound cruel and certain, while Rick folded his arms with a smug grin, feeding off the chief's authority. Danielle forced her breathing steady, her mind racing through every protocol, every option. And then she glanced down as Dominique shifted, and for the briefest second, a glint of silver flashed across the floor. The badge Dominique had slipped from her pocket, letting it fall just outside the bars where the overhead light caught the letters FBI. The room went silent again as the insignia gleamed, undeniable proof of their authority, but instead of shock or remorse. Holt simply crouched down, picked it up slowly, and twirled it in his hand like a toy, then rose to his full height and placed it deliberately into his pocket. "Well now," he said softly, "thank you for confirming what I already suspected. Federal agents indeed. That makes things more delicate, but also more rewarding, because now your disappearance will mean more favors, more gratitude from those who prefer the Bureau kept out of our business." Danielle's stomach turned, her voice sharp as steel. "If anything happens to us, the Bureau will come down on this town with everything it has." Holt leaned closer, lowering his voice to a chilling whisper. "Only if they know where to look. And after tonight, they won't." The words sank into the stale air, heavy and final. But then a new voice interrupted, quiet yet firm. It was Officer Jenny Morales, standing at the back of the room, her young face pale but determined. She cleared her throat nervously. "Chief, maybe we should log the arrest properly. Run IDs. Make sure we're covered." Holt's eyes flicked toward her, a sharp warning in his glare, but she held her ground, shifting slightly, her hand brushing against her notepad where she had already scribbled a phone number. A lifeline, Danielle noticed, her sharp eyes catching the movement, and understood immediately, not everyone in this station was rotten. As Holt turned back to issue orders, Morales drifted close enough to the cell to slip the note through the bars, her face blank to avoid suspicion, but her gesture clear, and Danielle closed her hand over the scrap of paper, tucking it away unseen. Rick barked, "We're wasting time. Throw them in the back. Let's finish this." Holt raised his hand, silencing him. "No, not yet. We do this carefully. We build a record, stack charges, make sure nobody questions it later. They'll rot here first." Danielle and Dominique exchanged a glance, the kind of wordless exchange only twins could share, a silent agreement that the fight had only begun. And as the cell door clanged shut again, Danielle whispered under her breath so only her sister could hear, "We survive tonight. Tomorrow, we take them all down." The cell smelled of bleach and old sweat, fluorescent light humming like a distant warning, and as dawn edged in, the sisters laid still, listening, counting the slow footsteps outside. Because in Copper Creek, the quiet had taught them more than noise ever could. And what unfolded next pulled back the curtain on a network far larger than 3 drunk officers. Word reached the field office in New Orleans before the sun was fully up. And Danielle, through clenched teeth, managed one whispered call on a smuggled line, only to hear a voice she had once trusted, Robert Keene, her bureau supervisor, answer with a tone that slid from routine to cold in an instant. "Hold pat. Agent Johnson. Do not escalate. This is a local matter. We don't need headlines here." It landed like a punch. Keene's words were not assistance. They were a muzzle. And Dominique felt the air thin as the realization spread. Some in the bureau were entangled in the same web they had come to expose. Meanwhile, outside the station, Luis Ramirez, hands shaking, staggered through the smoke and ash of what had been Bayou Jack's, his bar still smoldering from the arson that had gutted years of family work and the hidden hard drives tucked in the safe. He had watched the sisters dragged out, had hidden a backup drive in a place only he and the judge knew. And now, between coughing breaths, he dialed a number he hoped would not betray him, a number belonging to Maya Brooks, an investigative reporter who had been sniffing around Copper Creek for months and who had, in the past, paid for her courage with threats and bruises. Maya arrived within the hour in a battered sedan, face set, not because she loved risk, but because she loved truth. And she met Luis with a grim calm. She took the battered drive, the one with the bar footage, and began a backup plan to replicate and hide the file in multiple places, because she understood that in this town, data was as vulnerable as a thin-skinned eye. Back inside the station, tension became orchestration as Chief Holt summoned officers into a back room. Whispering orders with the meticulous cruelty of a man who had learned to make the courthouse sing his tune, he instructed that paperwork be falsified, that witness statements be coached, that cameras be checked and malfunctioning recorded. He arranged an alibi of routine procedure that would make any external inquiry stall at paperwork and protocol. And when a deputy asked nervously if they should really go this far, Holt smiled without warmth and told him that loyalty paid in privileges no one outside the system would imagine. But not everyone in blue wore their loyalty like armor. Officer Jenny Morales, sleepless the night before, had gone home and stared at the ceiling thinking of the way Rick had laughed, of the way Mark had slammed a woman's arm into wood, and she felt something inside her break. She could no longer keep quiet. With a trembling hand, she texted a single line to a number she had been given months ago by Judge Clarence Whitaker, an old jurist who had quietly kept files and names for years, the kind of judge who had watched the system choke on its own rot and kept his ledger in case someone brave ever knocked. The judge answered, voice soft and tired, and told her to trust no one with a badge unless they had his code word. He arranged, through a network of retired clerks and one trusted pastor, a small meeting at his house where the sisters, if freed for a moment, could synchronize the scattered pieces of proof, Luis's footage, Maya's backups, the judge's paperwork, and the whispering confessions Daniel and Dominique had collected in the cell through careful listening. It was a fragile lattice of hope, but it was hope nonetheless. While all these pieces clattered into motion, the station grew more brittle, Holt ordered that the sisters be formally charged with resisting arrest and obstruction. Charges crafted with the kind of sloppy precision that would pass routine review because it matched the town's appetite for quick closures over truth. He even had a prosecutor on retainer who owed favors. A man whose family had lent Holt money during rough patches. The system had become currency, and Holt spent it lavishly. Danielle, overhearing fragments through the wall, felt anger and a cold. Tactical clarity settled over her. She counted the names she had heard whispered in the cell the night before, cataloged the phrases Holt used, the offhand mention of favors, the reference to judges and buried reports, and she realized this was not isolated corruption, but a network with roots deep into county infrastructure. Dominique, slower to speak, but quicker to act, began to plan with the practical mind of someone who had trained for chaos. Memorize faces, identify weak points, map escape timing, note the blind spots on the cameras, remember the cadence of guard shifts, and hold tight to the knowledge that Luis's drive and Maya's tenacity could turn a desperate scrape into leverage outside. Word of the sisters' arrest had slipped like oil across town. A small knot of neighbors gathered near the courthouse steps, curious, fearful, whispering about the two women who had returned as if nothing had happened, and Judge Whitaker, a man who carried the weight of decades on his back, stepped out into the light with files under his arm and a resolve that had not been broken by years of threats. He met with Maya briefly, handed over a sealed packet of case notes and a list of judges who could be trusted to at least read an affidavit, and then sent Maya to every contact she had at state outlets to keep the story alive beyond local control. The strategy was messy, imperfect, human. Get the footage out, secure copies in several hands, elicit a leak big enough to make the Department of Justice open a sleeve they could not shut, and most important, find allies inside who would not be bribed into silence. Danielle and Dominique felt the earth shift beneath the cage of small-town authority the moment Jenny Morales slipped a tiny paper through the bars. The scrap with a phone number and a time. 2 digits that meant rescue if the sisters played their part, and the timing aligned with Maya's contacts and Judge Whitaker's safe houses. Danielle tucked the note into the seam of her shoe and let her mind move from survival mode into execution mode. Tonight, they lied low, played broken. Let the system think it had won. Tomorrow they would set a trap so clean that even the men who thought themselves untouchable might not see the rope. Meanwhile, Robert Keene's message echoed like a betrayal. His instruction to stand down was not just caution. It was an attempt to smother the flame before it grew into a national fire. And that knowledge hardened the sisters' resolve. If the Bureau would not lead, they would force the Bureau's hand with evidence even a compromised supervisor could not ignore. Luis, coughing between phone calls, hid another copy of the drive in a place only Judge Whitaker and his late wife had known about, while Maya, bruised but unbeaten, typed with trembling fingers, uploading snippets to servers outside state lines, seeding the footage in encrypted channels so it could not be erased by local power. The plan, fragile as a spider's web in a storm, had momentum now. It needed only the right gust to hold and the right hands to pull. As the sun rose and Copper Creek hummed its ordinary, unaware rhythms, Danielle and Dominique lay quiet in their cell, feeling the weight of years of silence and the brittle hope of allies. And when Dominique whispered, "We move at dusk," it was not fear that trembled in her voice, but a fierce, certain calm that comes when people decide they will not be erased. The night pressed heavy over Copper Creek, thunder rolling in the distance like a warning, and inside the police station the tension was a storm of its own, because Chief Holt had just left the holding area with Danielle's FBI badge in his pocket, while Rick, Mark, and Kyle swaggered down the hall, drunk on power and certain nothing could touch them. Yet outside, forces were already moving, and the sisters could feel it in the air. Luis Ramirez's bar had gone up in flames. the work of a Molotov tossed through a window at dawn, smoke still rising as fire crews poured water over blackened wood. And Luis, coughing from the ash, carried with him a single small drive hidden in his boot. The only surviving copy of the footage that could prove the sisters' arrest was a setup. Meanwhile, Maya Brooks drove battered roads with her laptop open on the passenger seat, uploading fragments of the file to servers in Atlanta, Baton Rouge, and Houston, knowing the men inside the station would try to bury every trace. While Judge Whitaker shuffled through boxes of papers in his modest home, case files dating back 20 years, documenting missing suspects, falsified reports, false arrests, a ledger of corruption with Chief Holt's signature in more places than anyone would believe. But inside the cell, Danielle and Dominique played their roles like seasoned agents, heads down, voices low, letting the men outside think they were broken. Even as their minds worked like machines, Dominique whispered, "We need out tonight." And Danielle nodded, already calculating. They both knew Jenny Morales was wavering, her conscience bleeding through her uniform. And sure enough, near dusk, Morales appeared at the bars, her eyes darting left and right, slipping a folded keycard and a message scrawled on a sticky note. "Warehouse, midnight." The sisters tucked it away, their faces unreadable. Moments later, Holt returned, calling Rick, Mark, and Kyle into his office, the door shutting with a click. Through thin walls, the sisters caught fragments of his plan, the bar's destruction written as accidental gas leak, the sisters framed for assaulting officers, the reports ready for a judge he controlled, their transfer scheduled to an undisclosed facility by morning. Dominique's muscles coiled with fury, Danielle's mind sharpened with urgency, and when Morales passed by again, Danielle whispered 2 words through the bars, "Thank you," and saw the young officer's eyes glisten with guilt before she walked away. At midnight, with rain starting to patter against the tin roof, Morales unlocked the cell with trembling hands and led them down a back corridor, whispering, "They're planning to take you out to the swamp. Call it an escape gone wrong. Don't come back here. Ever." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading. Outside, a cruiser waited, and Rick Callahan was already there, leaning on the hood, a bottle in one hand, shotgun in the other, grinning like a man who had been promised blood. "Told you ladies this night would be long," he said, as Mark and Kyle stepped out from the shadows, weapons ready. And the sisters realized Morales hadn't freed them. She had delivered them into a trap. But what the officers didn't know was that the sisters had read the signs, had prepared. And as Mark grabbed Dominique's arm, she twisted, driving her elbow into his throat, the move practiced and sharp, while Danielle kicked the shotgun from Rick's hand, the barrel clattering against wet pavement. Kyle lunged clumsily, too drunk, too reckless, and Dominique caught him by the wrist, spun him, and slammed him into the cruiser hard enough to rattle the windows. The fight spilled across gravel and mud, rain soaking uniforms and skin, grunts and shouts echoing in the dark. Mark swung wild, but Danielle ducked and drove her knee into his ribs, the air rushing from his chest. Rick pulled a knife, slashing at the air, but Dominique caught his wrist, twisted, and forced him face down into the dirt, his cheek grinding against gravel. The sisters fought not as victims but as agents who had been cornered too many times to fold, their training blending with fury, their movements efficient and merciless. Within minutes, the 3 men were on the ground, cuffed with their own restraints, cursing, spitting, but powerless. Danielle yanked Rick's badge from his belt, held it in front of his face, and hissed, "You think this shield makes you untouchable? Tonight, it damns you." Dominique, chest heaving, looked toward the road that led to the warehouse Morales had scrawled, and said, "We're not done. Holt's still inside." But Danielle shook her head, pointing to the cruiser camera still blinking red. We're going to use their own system. We stream it. We make sure the world sees them confess." She leaned close to Rick, pressed record, and demanded, "Say it. Who ordered the frame-up? Who burned the bar?" Rick spat blood, eyes defiant, but Dominique tightened the cuffs until his face twisted in pain. Finally, he broke, muttering. "It was Holt. Holt said to torch it, said to bury the agents, said the Bureau would look the other way." Danielle glanced at the lens, her voice cold. "And you just admitted it on tape." She uploaded the file to the cloud, the light blinking as the data left Copper Creek. The sisters stood tall in the rain, their enemies at their feet, but the storm was only beginning, because they knew Chief Holt would not wait quietly once word spread. And tomorrow the whole town would erupt when the truth came crashing through the walls he had built for decades. The warehouse loomed in the dark swamp like a carcass of rust and shadows, its broken windows staring out like dead eyes. And this was where Chief Holt had ordered Rick, Mark, and Kyle to finish what they started, to erase Danielle and Dominique Carter from the earth. But instead, the sisters dragged their captors here in cuffs, storm-wet and broken, and turned the tables in a way no one could have imagined. Dominique shoved Rick forward, his boots slipping on the wet concrete, his face smeared with blood and rain, while Danielle held the recovered body cam high, its red light blinking, already streaming to servers far beyond Copper Creek, and her voice cut through the hollow cavern of the building like steel. "Tell the truth, Rick. Tell them how many women you dragged here before us." Rick spat blood and tried to sneer, but Dominique's hand tightened on his shoulder until he hissed in pain. And Mark, cradling his shattered wrist, muttered, "This is insane. Nobody will believe you." Danielle turned the camera on him, her voice calm but deadly. "They'll believe your own words. Every charge you faked, every confession you bragged about. It's all here." Kyle whimpered from where he sat, cuffed to a rusted beam, his face swollen, still reeling from the fight by the cruiser, whispering, "Chief'll kill us if we talk." Dominique leaned down, her eyes burning. "No, he'll leave you to rot. We're giving you one chance to save yourself. Talk." Rain hammered the roof. Thunder cracked, and for a moment it felt like the heavens themselves demanded confession. Rick broke first, drunk courage melting under the reality of cold steel and flashing red light, his words slurred but damning. "Holt runs it all, the drugs, the setups, the judges. He told us to take you out tonight, make it look clean, like another escape gone bad." Danielle's lips curled into a bitter smile, because that was the piece they needed, and she turned the camera to Dominique, who added, "Now tell them about the quotas, Rick, about how you targeted black families, how you planted guns, how you buried complaints." Rick's eyes flickered with panic, but Dominique pressed his face into the floor until his voice cracked. Fine. Yeah, we did it. Holt told us to keep the numbers high, to keep the town scared. He said it kept the grants coming, said it kept property cheap for his developer friends." Danielle steadied the camera, her heart hammering, because this was bigger than crooked cops drunk on power. This was a machine built on fear, money, and silence. She looked into the lens and spoke directly to the unseen audience, her tone heavy. "This isn't just about us. It's about every person who lost their life, their home, their family to men who thought their badges made them gods. Tonight, we end that lie." At that very moment, headlights slashed across the swamp road outside, engines rumbling, voices shouting over the rain, and Dominique hissed, "Back up!" As she yanked Rick to his knees, the warehouse doors burst open, and in poured more uniforms, rifles raised, eyes hard. At their center stood Chief Holt himself, tall, silver-haired, coat pressed immaculate despite the storm, his smile cold as marble. Well, he said smoothly, stepping forward, his voice carrying over the chaos. My favorite troublemakers. Did you really think you'd walk out of here alive? Danielle didn't flinch. She raised the body cam higher, its red light blinking like a heartbeat. They've already seen it. Holt, the whole country's watching. Holt's smile widened, but his eyes were knives. Stream it all you want. Sweetheart, you think Washington cares about a few drunks in a swamp? Evidence disappears, servers crash, agents get reassigned. That's how the world works. Dominique pulled Rick forward, shouting, "He confessed! On record! It's over! Holt!" But Holt's calm never cracked. "No, Agent Carter, it's only beginning. You underestimated how deep this goes. The Bureau, the State House, the courts. Do you think you're the first to try and fight me? Ask your supervisor Keene how well that worked out." Danielle's stomach turned, but her face stayed stone. She knew the betrayal went higher, but she also knew Holt was bluffing about control, because panic had already seeped into his ranks. She saw it in the way some officers glanced at each other, shifting uneasily, their rifles trembling slightly, as whispers of live stream and evidence buzzed at the edges of their minds. Dominique seized the moment, her voice fierce. "You can shoot us, Holt, but you'll do it on camera, with the world watching, and when you do, every crooked deal, every stolen life, will burn down with you." Silence crackled, broken only by rain hammering the roof. Then, from the back of the line, Officer Morales stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "She's right. I saw the feed. It's everywhere. You can't stop it." Holt's head snapped toward her, fury flashing. "Traitor!" He spat. Morales didn't move, didn't blink, just raised her voice louder. "I'm done protecting you. So are half the men here. They're tired of your lies." A ripple moved through the officers, guns lowering, eyes darting between chief and sisters, loyalty cracking under the weight of truth. Holt snarled, reaching for his pistol, but Dominique moved like lightning, slamming Rick into his knees to block the shot while Danielle lunged forward, her shoulder crashing into Holt's chest. The gun went skittering across the floor, Morales kicking it aside, and suddenly the warehouse erupted in chaos, half the officers scrambling to restrain Rick, Mark, and Kyle, the other half torn between orders and conscience. Danielle pinned Holt against a beam, her face inches from his, her voice steady. "You're finished. The whole world knows who you are." Holt struggled, his voice dripping venom. "You think this town will thank you? You've destroyed everything." Dominique joined her, her voice low. "No, Holt, we've given it back." Morales snapped handcuffs onto Holt's wrists, his power bleeding away with the metallic click. Cameras flashed outside as reporters, tipped by the stream, had already arrived, their lights piercing the broken windows, capturing Holt's walk of shame as federal agents stormed in moments later. Alerted by the live feed Morales had shared, Rick, Mark, and Kyle were dragged past the press, their drunken protests drowned out by shouted questions and flashing bulbs. Holt, his face pale, jaw clenched, tried to keep his composure, but the sight of microphones shoved at his face broke his mask at last, and he shouted, "This isn't justice! This is treason!" Danielle's voice rang out from the shadows of the warehouse, calm and cutting. "No, Holt, this is accountability." The night ended with sirens echoing across Copper Creek. The warehouse lit up like a stage, every secret finally dragged into the open, and as the sisters stood side by side, bruised but unbroken, they knew this was more than survival. It was the spark of something larger, a fire that would sweep across every corrupt corner Holt and men like him had built, and nothing could put it out now. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in Copper Creek, not in thunder and rain, but in the pounding of television helicopters overhead, in the chants of protesters filling Main Street, and in the sound of reporters shouting questions as Chief Darnell Holt, once untouchable, was led out of the warehouse in handcuffs, his silver hair plastered by rain, his polished shoes splashing in the mud, the weight of 1,000 cameras catching every step of his fall. And inside that same night, the Carter sisters stood together in the federal command post set up outside town. Bruised, exhausted, but with their heads unbowed, watching as Rick Callahan, Mark Donnelly, and Kyle Hayes were processed into federal custody, their swagger replaced with wide eyes and trembling hands, the realization dawning that orange jumpsuits would replace their badges forever. Yet the victory, as sweet as it felt in that hour, was only the beginning of a reckoning that shook every corner of the state and beyond, because by morning the live stream had been clipped, shared, and broadcast on every major network, the sisters' names trending nationwide, hashtags calling for hashtag justice in Copper Creek and hashtag clean the badge exploding across social media, and phone lines in Washington ringing off the hook as lawmakers demanded answers. The Department of Justice dispatched a Civil Rights Division task force within 24 hours, seizing files, freezing accounts, and announcing a sweeping investigation that would span 3 counties, uncovering not just Holt's crimes, but decades of rot buried under his command. While in Atlanta, their betrayed supervisor Robert Keene was dragged into the spotlight, his name exposed in Rick's drunken confession, and by Friday morning he too was in cuffs, indicted for conspiracy and obstruction, his 25-year FBI career ending in disgrace as he was perp-walked before the same cameras that had once celebrated him. And the public shock only grew when Maya Brooks, her face still bandaged from the brutal assault weeks earlier, returned to the steps of a federal courthouse holding a binder thick with evidence, announcing to the world that she, Judge Whitaker, and Luis Ramirez had compiled records, videos, and financial trails that went back nearly 2 decades, proof of land grabs disguised as police operations, Black families targeted for false arrests so their homes could be seized and flipped for profit, teachers smeared with planted evidence to silence complaints, small businesses shaken down until they shuttered, a system not of mistakes but of deliberate design, and the sight of Maya, her voice unshaken despite broken ribs, declaring, "This time the truth will not burn," became a rallying cry across America, sparking town halls, marches, and congressional hearings within weeks. In Copper Creek itself, the aftermath was immediate and raw. The police department gutted overnight. 17 officers indicted within the first sweep, 5 more under investigation. The jail half empty as wrongful convictions were overturned. Mothers clutching sons who walked free after years stolen. Tears streaming as the courthouse steps became a place of reunions instead of heartbreak. And in the midst of it all, Danielle and Dominique returned not as victims, but as warriors of justice. Standing before the community hall packed with residents who had lived too long under fear, telling them with steady voices, "You are not alone anymore." And the crowd, elders and children alike, rose to their feet, chanting their names not as heroes but as sisters of the town, proof that resilience could break even the most suffocating chains. Federal reform followed, not in distant committee rooms but right there on the ground, as a Civil Rights Division office opened permanently in Copper Creek, staffed with investigators and auditors tasked to monitor every case, every arrest, every dollar flowing in and out of the department, while Luis Ramirez, his bar reduced to ashes, rebuilt with donations from across the country, reopening not just as a bar, but as a community center, walls lined with framed stills from the live stream that had toppled an empire of corruption. And Judge Whitaker, finally free from decades of silence, became the face of a movement to push for nationwide oversight boards, his gravel voice carrying weight as he declared at a Senate hearing, "If it can happen here, it can happen anywhere, and we will not allow it again." The fallout touched every life. Holt faced a federal trial that laid bare the depth of his crimes, with testimony from mothers, shopkeepers, and teachers he had destroyed. His cold stare breaking only when Danielle read aloud the names of those lost to his system. Rick Callahan was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. Mark Donnelly, 35, Kyle Hayes, 30, their drunken arrogance replayed for juries as proof of their cruelty. Keene, stripped of pension and honor, received 20 years for betrayal of public trust. His name now spoken with disgust by colleagues who once respected him. And the message spread clear and loud. No badge, no title, no office would shield those who preyed on the vulnerable. But it was not only punishment that grew from the sisters' fight. It was transformation, because Copper Creek became a model for what reform could look like. Civilian review boards with real power, body cams linked to public cloud servers, evidence tracking software that even prosecutors couldn't alter, and community forums held monthly where officers faced the people they served not in fear, but in accountability. And slowly, painfully, trust began to flicker back to life. Danielle and Dominique chose not to return to Washington immediately. Instead, they walked the streets with the townspeople, listening, hugging, advising, building a bridge between federal muscle and local voice. And when Mrs. Washington, the mother whose son had lost 3 years in prison, handed them his acceptance letter to Howard University, saying through tears, "He has a future again because of you." The sisters knew every bruise, every betrayal, every long night had been worth it. Yet they also knew this was not the end, because corruption was not a single man or a single department. It was a system that thrived in silence, and so they pledged to keep fighting, founding the Carter Initiative for Police Accountability, funded in part by donations pouring from across the nation, aiming to expose, train, and reform departments wherever communities cried out for justice, as the sun set weeks later over a town once strangled by fear. The sisters stood on the rebuilt porch of Luis's new bar, now called the Phoenix, and looked out at neighbors laughing, children running, music playing freely for the first time in years. And Dominique whispered, "We broke their machine," while Danielle replied softly, "No, we gave people the tools to break it themselves." And somewhere in a federal prison, Holt stared at the walls of his cell, his empire reduced to ashes, his legacy not of order but of disgrace, knowing his downfall had come not from bullets or power plays, but from the courage of 2 women who refused to bow, 2 sisters whose voices carried farther than any badge ever could, echoing across America as proof that truth, once freed, can never be chained again. 3 months after Copper Creek erupted into the national spotlight, the echoes of that storm still lingered, not as fear, but as a quiet determination that carried through every street, courthouse, and home. Because what began as 2 sisters being dragged in cuffs from a small-town bar had grown into a movement reshaping the nation's conversation about justice, accountability, and power. And it was in that season of reckoning that Danielle and Dominique Carter returned. Not as agents undercover or survivors of abuse, but as symbols of a community's rebirth. Walking hand in hand through the renovated town square where banners now read, "No one above the law," while neighbors stopped to thank them with hugs, tears, and whispered stories of their own struggles finally seeing daylight. Yet as powerful as those moments were, the sisters never let themselves forget the price that had been paid, because Luis's bar had been burned to the ground. Maya Brooks had nearly lost her life. Judge Whitaker had risked everything to bring his hidden records forward, and Jenny Morales had walked away from her badge, knowing it meant severing ties with her entire career. And so the sisters carried not just pride, but responsibility, determined that their victory would not fade into another headline lost to time. On the federal level, the Carter Initiative for Police Accountability had been formally launched, seeded with a $20 million endowment raised from public donations and private allies who believed in the cause. And within weeks, it was funding audits in towns across the South, training whistleblowers, and pushing for independent oversight, while in Washington, congressional hearings used Copper Creek as their prime example, senators playing clips of Rick Callahan's drunken rant and Holt's smirk as he claimed, "My town, my rules." proof of how unchecked authority metastasized into tyranny. Reforms moved forward. Mandatory body cam cloud uploads, independent review boards with subpoena power, grants tied to compliance with civil rights audits. And though change came slowly, painfully, the seed had been planted, and the sisters could feel its roots spreading. Back home, Copper Creek itself had been transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Holt's old station demolished, replaced by a new justice center with glass walls and public viewing galleries. A design meant to remind both officers and citizens that transparency was no longer optional. Rick, Mark, and Kyle had been sentenced to decades in federal prison, their mugshots plastered across national broadcasts, a warning to any officer tempted to abuse their badge, while Holt himself faced life without parole, his empire of intimidation crumbling piece by piece as former allies testified against him to save themselves. And Robert Keene, once so respected in the Bureau, sat in a cell of his own, his name now shorthand for betrayal. But if punishment was one side of the ledger, renewal was the other. And that renewal was visible in the faces of the freed, young men stepping out of prison with overturned convictions, their mothers waiting with open arms, teachers reinstated with apologies after years of disgrace, small businesses reopening with loans from a federal compensation fund established because Maya Brooks refused to let the financial trail vanish, and every week the community gathered in the hall to tell stories not of fear, but of resilience. Voices that once whispered now echoing proudly. For the sisters. The most poignant moment came on a warm Sunday afternoon when Mrs. Washington, whose son had lost 3 years to a false charge, invited them to his send-off party before college, the yard filled with neighbors, music, and laughter. And when the young man himself approached, holding out his acceptance letter to Howard University, his eyes full of gratitude, he said simply, "You gave me back my life." And Dominique had to look away to hide the tears, while Danielle hugged him tightly, whispering, "No, you fought for it. We just cleared the path." Yet even amid joy there was danger, because movements create enemies, and more than once the sisters received threats, anonymous letters warning them to stop, dark SUVs parked too long outside their homes, whispers of old networks still trying to protect themselves. But they had grown beyond fear, and instead of retreating, they doubled down, telling their story on national stages, sitting for interviews with 60 Minutes, writing op-eds in the Washington Post, and addressing conferences of civil rights lawyers, always with the same message: accountability is not anti-police, it is pro-justice. Their words resonated especially with Americans over 50, who remembered segregation, who remembered watching movements rise and fall, and who now saw in the sisters' fight a continuation of the struggle for dignity that had spanned generations. By the time autumn leaves turned Copper Creek gold, the sisters found themselves back at the very bar where it all began, rebuilt by Luis and renamed the Phoenix, its charred ruins replaced with polished wood, photographs of protests, framed articles, and a mural of community members raising their fists together. And as they sat at a corner table, sipping sweet tea instead of whiskey, they reflected not on their suffering, but on their survival. Dominique said quietly, "It almost broke us." And Danielle answered, "But breaking was never an option." Around them, laughter filled the air. Children darted between tables. And Maya, her arm still healing but her spirit blazing, stood on a small stage announcing her book deal and her nationwide investigation series. Judge Whitaker, leaning on his cane, toasted with his water glass, declaring, "To truth, finally free." Jenny Morales, no longer an officer, but now a community advocate, received a standing ovation when Luis pointed her out, the crowd chanting her name. And in that moment, Danielle and Dominique realized the true legacy of their ordeal was not just corrupt men in prison or laws rewritten, but a town that had found its voice, a people who had reclaimed their dignity, and a country reminded that justice is fragile unless it is guarded fiercely by those willing to risk everything. As night fell and the square outside filled with lanterns, the sisters stepped onto the balcony of the Phoenix, looking out at the sea of faces lit with hope. And Danielle raised her voice one last time. They thought we were weak. They thought we would bow. They thought no one would care. But look around. You cared. You fought. You won. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. The crowd erupted, chanting, cheering, some in tears, some in laughter. And as Dominique clasped her sister's hand, she whispered, "We didn't just survive. We sparked a fire." And Danielle nodded, eyes on the horizon where dawn would rise again. For in Copper Creek, the silence of fear was gone forever, replaced by a chorus of resilience. And though the fight for justice would never truly end, the sisters knew that this chapter, this victory, would live as proof that even in the darkest night, truth can still find its voice, and once spoken, it can never be silenced again. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we keep these voices alive.